Hello, welcome to Unsilenced. My name is Shelby Smith. I'm here today with Emilee, who is kind enough to sit down with us and share some elements of her experience and her story. With that said, Emilee, do you want to give us a brief introduction about, who you are, where you're from, what you do, what led you here?
So I'm Emilee. I'm 27 years old, and I'm from the Central Valley in California. So I had 3 VCUGs, which my understanding is that's pretty good compared to some people's experience. I had my first one when I was 4 years old, according to my records, but I don't have any memory of that one. And then again when I was 7. And then again after I had like the valve surgery to correct the reflux at 8 years old. So 2 that I remember, 1 which I don't. The ones that I remember, there wasn't a whole lot of empathy from anyone in the room. And to give some background too, I think I'm kind of representative of like the ideal scenario patient. I had a lot of other medical issues, and so I was already very used to like invasive medical procedures and getting poked and prodded in like uncomfortable areas. Very, very kind of people-pleasing attitude too, because I loved like the pats on the back that I'd get from like medical staff of like, wow, you're so well behaved, wow, you didn't cry. And I'd be like, wow, yeah, no, I didn't, because I'm such a good kid. The day of the one when I was 7, so the first one that I remember, I was in a really good mood. It was the weekend. I was fascinated by medical procedures. So being told I was going to get an x-ray done of my stomach and my bladder, I was super excited about that. I was like goofing around and making jokes and all this stuff until they started hurting me, holding my legs down for the procedure. For all intents and purposes, I think everything was set up to go really smoothly if it was going to go smoothly for anyone. And it didn't. It was an older nurse who started by cleaning my genitalia, and she was using what they call the brown soap. And I told her like, oh, hey, like that kind of hurts, like that kind of is stinging. And she gave me this look like, you're lying. No, it doesn't sting. Get over it. I've got to do this. And so that was kind of like my first clue in that something wasn't quite right. Because I mean, I had never really had that experience with like a medical professional of being like dismissed that way. And my mom was in the room with me and she didn't really say anything either. And then I guess the other thing to know is I had a pretty severe case of VUR. Like I was pretty much always on antibiotics. So I was definitely someone they needed to operate on. So I likely had an active UTI while they were cleaning my genitalia and doing all of this. So it's like, okay, yeah, no crap, it hurt. It's gonna hurt. So then when they started trying to catheterize me, I had to be held down. Multiple nurses or assistants or doctors in the room holding my legs, down and open on the table. And I, completely out of character for me, I was crying, begging, kicking, screaming, doing everything I could to like try to get them to stop and tire them out so they would give me some space. And I had my mom off to my side giving me like this look of disgust, like she was just so appalled by my behavior and like, wow, I can't believe my child is behaving in this way. But then telling me to like just let them do it because it was the weekend and we had things we needed to do. Once I realized my mom wasn't going to tell them to stop, I thought, okay, I'm going to scream louder because my dad and my sister are outside in the waiting room. Maybe they'll be able to hear me and then they'll come in and tell these people to stop. Well, they didn't. Nothing happened. And I've even since asked my sister, like, hey, were you able to hear anything out there? And she said no. A lot of kids I know have trauma around like the voiding part, or the inflation of the bladder part or the filling of the bladder part. My mom seems to remember, and I think this must have been from my VCUG when I was 4, me being very hesitant about the voiding part of the procedure, which makes sense. Like a potty training age kid or a kid freshly out of potty training has been told not to wet the bed or not to pee on things, and then is being told to pee on this table that, resembles a bed. Then I do remember when I got home after the catheter was taken out, I went to go pee because I had been instructed to pee when I get home, and it burned like nothing I could imagine. We got home probably like early afternoon from the hospital. I didn't pee until well after dinner. My parents were like running cold water over my hands, and then they tried warm water over my hands. Everything, I just like held it in and was like, nope, I'm gonna go as long as I can without peeing. And then my parents threatened me too with like, well, if you don't pee, you're going to have kidney failure and you're going to have to get surgery to get your kidney replaced. And then the one post surgery, I had a nurse that time who was a little bit more empathetic. I think she was a little bit younger. And so she came up to my head when I was laid on the table before they started doing everything, because I think she could see how tense I was, because this time around I knew what to expect. And she did this demonstration of like, well, okay, when you're tense, your urethra is going to be like a closed fist. And then the catheter, we're trying to get it in there and you're tense, so we can't. And so then she relaxes her fist and shows how it goes in. But I mean, I was 8 years old. An 8-year-old doesn't know how to like relax their pelvic floor muscles or anything like that. They also that time gave me like a plastic straw, and they were telling me to like take deep breaths through that. And I just remember like I couldn't get over this feeling that like it's like having a catheter in both ends. Like, this is gross. I hate this. And then yeah, again, refusing to pee when I got home until I absolutely had to.
How would you say that the VCUG test that you received affected your relationship with your body?
So I was terrified of my genitalia after that. At the point immediately after my first one, I believe I was still doing like showers supervised by my mom, but she was just like making sure we washed everything and weren't like goofing off. And so like if I had to wash like my genitals with a washcloth, I'd do it really quick. As soon as she wasn't in the room anymore, I stopped. When I would like wipe after going to the bathroom, I would like wad up tissue paper or toilet paper into like this really thick cushion basically, and use that to dab my genitals clean so that I wouldn't have to feel my like anatomy through it if it were thinner. Like, I didn't want to feel any parts of my genitalia, like even that young. I don't remember any like time doing like early exploration or any kind of like masturbation. That didn't happen for a really, really long time. Really delayed in that department. Anything involving genitalia, I was terrified of. Terrified of sex, terrified of touching myself. Bad relationship with my body, to the point where I wasn't properly cleaning myself either.
That makes complete sense, especially since, sexual trauma in early childhood is considered one of the most, like, just the worst kinds of abuse you can suffer. You really don't have the capacity in your brain to understand, like, what sex is, what sexual organs are, and it just makes total sense that would overwhelm any kid of any age. How would you compare your last description of that relationship to your body with who you are today? And, you're a married woman. What are your views around intimacy like now? Are there still challenges?
I'm okay with him touching me, if that makes sense, but I don't want to touch myself. I'm also dealing with vaginismus, and so any kind of vaginal penetration is currently like off the table. And I'm working with a sex therapist, and I'll probably have to do pelvic floor physical therapy, but right now the latter of the two is just still like too terrifying to contemplate. But yeah, haven't been able to use tampons, much less any kind of penetration, really. And that's been ostracizing too. I mean, I remember like middle school, high school, girls talking about like tampons as if it's inevitable that you will graduate to tampons, and that's how you become like a grown-up, or that's how you become mature. And then, I was sitting there listening to these conversations like, I can't see myself ever using tampons, because at that point it was just like I had absolutely no desire to stick anything up there. I didn't even have the desire to try, frankly. And so I was like, I guess I'll never be a woman then. Like, this is great. It felt kind of ostracizing that way. And like friends who knew I was still using pads, I did feel like a little bit of judgment from them too. But yeah.
Yeah, that is super ostracizing, especially when you consider all the things that every woman has to face in a way, even people who didn't go through similar trauma, just that rite of passage, and like even just being able to be in social circles like during summers when everyone's going swimming, Was there a moment in time when you really felt like, hey, I can do this now? This is something I not only can do, but need to do, like feel the need to do.
When I found the original Reddit that's kind of been shut down, r/VCUG trauma, I knew I had anxiety for a long time. And so when I was initially having issues with my partner, now husband, trying to be intimate together, I kind of was chalking it up to anxiety once I had thought I ruled everything else out, because I was seeing people on the like vaginismus forums and stuff talking about sexual trauma, religious trauma. I'm like, okay, I don't have any of that. I've never been raped. I'm like, I know I have anxiety, but other than that, I like did research. Was I intersex at some point? Finally went to a sex therapist. And when I was filling out her intake forms, she asked about medical conditions, especially those involving like sexual organs and genitalia. And so I had to like go and look up like, oh, what was that thing called? The kidney reflux, and then the testing I had done. And I put it down, like not really thinking anything of it. And then as we talked about it and talked through it, I was like, oh yeah, well, this is kind of what was involved. And she asked me to like talk about my experience in that room. And she was like, hey, that sounds traumatic. And I was like, yeah, but it was my urethra, like why would it now be affecting like trying to have vaginal sex? And she was like, it definitely can be related. Like, let's delve more into this. Like, let's look more into this. Found the like Reddit pages, reading through all these stories and the research that people had put into that forum and that page, and then doing my own research too. It was sleepless nights of like, I couldn't shut my phone off and go to sleep. I just wanted to like keep reading through more and more, crying, angry, like finding out that this is incredibly common, that like all the sort of gaslighting that I had done to myself over the years of like, oh, well, I had probably just been dramatic. If I had actually relaxed, it probably would have been easier. And well, they needed to do this. So like it needed to be done. My VUR was operable. Finding out slowly that like all of those excuses I made for like the doctors and nurses in that room didn't really cut it. And that the responsibility was still on them to have done better by me in that room and give me compassionate care, figuring out how dirty I was done, basically. And that kids are still having this done, hundreds of thousands of these are performed each year. I just got so angry. I'm like, I can't do nothing. 20 years between my last one and now almost, you would think there would be some sort of innovation or change, when really all there is that they're doing differently now is like telling the parents to bring comfort objects for the child and like, oh, tell them a little bit more detail about what's going to happen to them. It's still not really giving a fair picture of what actually goes on in the room. And then now finding out that there are some facilities that are doing alternatives like drinkable contrast fluid or CVIS, which is, I mean, it still involves the catheter, which is not great to me, because that was the part that was super traumatic to me. But for some kids, having your parent right there next to you might be more comforting. I'm like, there are these alternatives, and we're not doing them for some odd reason. I have to speak up, right? And I know people aren't going to want to hear this because people don't want to think about children's genitalia and things that happen to children's genitalia in hospitals and doctors' offices. But it's important for these hundreds of thousands of kids going through this each year that we demand change. If I am ever able to have kids in spite of this trauma, I'm terrified of childbirth as well, pregnancy and childbirth. But if I am ever able to have children, the likelihood that I will genetically pass on the same condition and put my kids in the same position of needing this procedure, thinking that like I might not be able to demand something better. And if I refuse to have this done, they might want to take the kids away. They might call CPS. She's refusing medical care for her child. That's the selfish reason, for me and my future kids to not have to go through this, but on a larger scale, it's all kids. It's wrong.
Yeah, and I would definitely go as far as to gently correct you the same way I have to gently correct myself, and that is not selfish of you for wanting a normal life. It's not selfish for wanting a family like a lot of women do, and that was in a way stolen from you. The rage that hits you later in life, right? When you are an adult and you can see it with that adult lens and say, I was wronged. Everyone knows why this is a complex trauma, and that's because it's a very legal, very sometimes medically necessary procedure. What is your current attitude toward medical professionals who have been doing this test for a while?
I mean, I think it's like you said, it's a complex issue, right? It's a failure from the top down, really. I think that's part of the trouble is you can't really place the blame on any one individual. To be fair, the first starting point of someone who could have intervened would have been my parent, right? Who should have known me, known my personality, and had that context of how I normally act in medical situations and how normally I'm very, very compliant and very easy to work with. She could have said like, hey, can we do something else? Can we switch the way we're doing this? And that was a failure. From the nurses, they're dealing with tons of kids every day. And I understand that they, have to shut off their empathy a little bit. While they can do small things to try to comfort their child, it's not 100% their fault either, that they're overworked, underpaid, burnt out, and, they have to deal with tons of kids every day who are crying about things that might not seem about like a big deal. I get that point too. And then, the doctors who are ordering these procedures to be done, my urologist wasn't in the room. So I don't know that he ever really was like in the room to see the reality of a VCUG. So he could just be ordering these procedures to be done left and right, not really thinking anything of it and just trusting the text that told him like, oh, this is minimally invasive and it's only mildly uncomfortable. Like, he doesn't have that visibility. The hospitals, it's a failure because they don't want to spend the time and money to do something that, might take more time or might take more resources, like drinkable contrast fluid. That's a much longer appointment than a VCUG typically would be. And then, from the organizations, like pediatric organizations, urology organizations, research groups, there's so many, like, from their eyes, bigger fish to fry. They don't want to put their limited research funds into something that to them they've already, washed their hands of, and they're like, oh, well, if the kid has VUR, we can test that with a VCUG and confirm it, and then, everything's good. We have that solution already. They view that as a done deal. That's what, like 5 different touch points with the child where someone could like intervene, demand better, and no one does. So I know that there's probably some people who go into the medical field who don't have the best intentions and maybe do get some kind of like sick pleasure out of watching this happen to kids. But I think the majority, and in all of those touch points, it's really just a failure of like priorities or a failure of understanding, or, like they don't feel that they have the authority to be the change.
It was very, very well said. It's almost like, who is the most appropriate person to step forward right now and say, this is a problem and this is what we need to do? Especially when things go through so many hands, it's easy to say, well, why didn't someone do something? But maybe all those people are waiting for someone else to do something.
That's a hard thing as a survivor speaking too, right? Because when we're making these TikToks and stuff about this, there's people coming into the comments and being, okay, well, what's the alternative? And I'm not the one with the medical degree. I'm saying, hey, this is a problem and I would like to collaborate on a solution, but I don't have a medical degree. I don't have any kind of license to help with medicine. I don't have any of that sort of thing. So while I have, some ideas, like I remember being probably around 10 years old and thinking like, well, couldn't they have given me the fluid to drink instead of putting it like directly into my bladder? But I didn't know if like drinkable contrast fluid was a thing. And then to find out like, 2 decades later that, they do that for some kids. I was like, hey, I thought of that at like 10 years old. But again, like, I'm not a doctor. Who am I to suggest things at the same time? So it's like, I think it really needs to be a collaboration or a collaborative effort.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. again, the complexity of the trauma can really make it seem like one side is villainizing the other, when in
Mhm.
reality, like, of course, like you said, we have to acknowledge that not everyone goes into the medical field with, honorable intentions, and that is true of any industry.
Yeah.
I think the disconnect is just happening over the time that has passed. All those decades we could have made this better. We could have been talking about it, or at the very least informing families.
I do remember talking to one doctor about the vaginismus piece of it because she was trying to get me to do a pap smear. And I was like, okay, well, did you read the part about me having like vaginismus? I can't do a pap smear. And she was like, all right, so like do some therapy and come back in 3 months and then we'll try again. And I was like, oh, if you think like all of my trauma is going to be cured in 3 months, like I don't think so, boo boo. But yeah, so that was great.
Yeah,
But
I guess on one hand, it's like, thanks for acknowledging the mental health. On the other, it's not a magic fix. It might be a lifelong
no.
effort. Like, I feel like for most of us, it will be. And it's not a death
Mhm.
sentence, but it is definitely, in a way, like a lifelong sentence. How did it feel when you connected with other survivors in the organization and on Reddit?
So I think initially it was like anger, not towards the people sharing their stories, but just to find the number of people sharing their stories and how many people had very similar stories to mine, if not worse. I mean, I had a VCUG when I was 4 years old, but I don't remember it. But then it was just thinking about like a kid the size of my nephew, my godson, who's currently 4 years old. I'm like someone holding him down on a table and shoving things up his genitalia makes me sick. But yeah, just like reading these stories, like getting really angry, but then also being really grateful and like not feeling alone because I did for so long, like I'm so used to being a medical anomaly that I kind of wrote off the kidney reflux thing as like, oh, it's probably really rare. Like I'm like have all these medical issues that are super rare, and like every time I go to a doctor's office they would bring like all the other nurses and stuff in there to read my file and learn about something really rare. So I had kind of like written it off for so long that like, oh, not only the gaslighting myself about the experience, but also just like this is probably like really rare, they probably don't have to do it very often. And then like finding this barrage of people sharing these horrifying stories about their experiences, many of which were much, much worse than my own. I mean, people having multiple VCUGs a year for over a decade. I at least can be grateful that they seem to keep my VCUGs to mostly a minimum. I mean, I know they probably didn't have to do the last one after my surgery because how can we see if the surgery worked if I don't get UTIs anymore? Didn't really need that last one. It's just horrifying at first, ultimately very comforting too. It's such a weird mix of emotions, right? Because it's like I'm so angry for these other people, but then also like thank God it's not just me, thank God I'm not alone, but then also I'm so sorry I'm not alone.
I don't think there's any good way to describe that, to be honest. Now that I think about it, it's very much the I'm so sorry we had to meet this way, but I'm glad to meet you. And then in terms of like other survivors, especially for a lot of the women who are just now finding out, maybe they had dissociative amnesia for decades or years, or so for those people, those women and those men who are finding out now, what is like one piece of advice you would want to share with them while they're going through this initial part?
I would just maybe say take your time and take care of yourself, especially at first. I mean, like I said, I didn't sleep, and just like the anger consuming me, I could feel the effect on the other parts of my health too, right? GI issues, shaking, sweating, not sleeping well. There were nights where I basically didn't get any sleep when I was first, reading about all this stuff. Practice self-care, make sure you're eating, make sure you're drinking water. If you can, take some time off of work because, I mean, it's hard to be productive too. It's almost like a grieving process, right? So I would just say, like, really focus on self-care. It's hard to resist going down the rabbit hole, but like if you can control yourself, maybe like limit it to like one story a day. If you feel comfortable talking to other people, I have found it very comforting to talk about with other people. I mean, I was discovering all of this community while I was engaged to my husband. So there were a lot of nights where he just kind of like hugged me and held me while I cried. And that was really comforting too. So as much as you can lean on a community around you, take care of yourself, take it easy.
Yeah. Excellent advice. I wish I knew you when I was going through this.
Relationship with my family has been a little bit strained. And I think it even was a little bit strained immediately after. I think it was a little bit harder to trust my mom, who was in the room with me. With my dad, I think when I started going through puberty, becoming very, very afraid of getting pregnant, I was very risk adverse. And so I definitely started to see my dad as a potential threat, with him being like the only man in the house. And so I do remember one time when I was maybe like 11 or 12, he was like saying goodnight to me, and he like kind of got on the bed with me and was tickling me, which wasn't super weird, but like I got suddenly like very terrified that he was going to like assault me or something like that, even though he never did anything of that sort or anything to really make me think he was going to. Just the fact that he was like a man getting into bed with me terrified me. And so I remember talking to my mom about it after, and I think she talked to him, even though I told her like not to. The rest of like puberty, my dad was very, like he almost didn't know what to do, right? And I think a lot of dads go through that when their like daughters go through puberty anyway, but we were so close when I was little. Like that experience, I think, represented like the point of it changing the relationship with him. And then yeah, me starting to perceive him as a threat. I didn't really want to be alone with him after that. So like our dentist appointments were always scheduled together, and I dreaded being like in a car alone with him. My father, who I used to be super close with. Immediately after the VCUGs too, there were definitely some changes. The school year after my surgery and after my VCUGs was very different from my previous school years. I was 8, starting 3rd grade, and I had a very hard time socially that next year. I previously was very, very friendly. I had a very easy time making friends before. I've been reading a lot of like child development books and things of that sort. And they say that when a child's relationship with their parent is insecure, they'll start to look for validation that they should be getting from their parents from other sources. And I wonder if that's what happened, because if this switch flipped and I felt like I couldn't trust my parents anymore, or I couldn't rely on them to keep me safe, even if I didn't consciously think that, if I was getting validation or looking for validation from my peers instead, like I would get really, really attached to like one person because I had a harder time making friends. And then when they would want to hang out with other people, it would really, really hurt. And I was like bouncing around between friend groups and having a hard time like trying to find a place to belong. So I didn't really have best friends after the VCUGs either. I don't think I really had a best friend for a while, maybe until high school, honestly. 8 years old, 3rd grade was also when I started having issues with trichotillomania. It's just a compulsive hair pulling, right? So some people, they do it with their hair, like from their head. Some people pull their eyebrows, their eyelashes, even like body hair. For me, I went to like my eyebrows and my eyelashes. And so I had like light skin and very dark hair, as you can see, dark eyebrows, dark eyelashes. So in particular times of stress, I would pull more. I kind of didn't look super normal, and kids can be ruthless. And so no one wants to hang out with the kid who looks like a freak. So I was stressed out because I couldn't make friends, which made me pull out my hair more. In addition, like this unresolved trauma I didn't know I was dealing with. And then because I pulled out my hair, that also prevented me from making friends. So it was just this vicious circle that I'm still dealing with today. I don't pull out my eyebrow hairs anymore, but I still compulsively pull out my eyelashes. It's almost even a tell that like my mental health is about to hit the fan, because it's like my body clues in before my brain catches up. It becomes like a a vicious circle to I'm like, oh my gosh, are people at work going to notice that I don't have any eyelashes? Let me try to cover it up with makeup as best I can. It just makes everything worse, right? Like adding in this element of like, I did this as an attempt to self-soothe, but now I'm really not self-soothed by it.
Yeah, it's like you're perpetuating the problem because your body's doing what it's supposed to do to help you cope and like live through it, which is so frustrating, especially
Yeah.
considering how much society already focuses on, like looks and appearance, and like the ads toward women are always very much like your body matters, your image matters. So I think that makes complete sense. Just because a kid remembers their VCUG doesn't necessarily mean that the traumatic reenactment won't happen, that the body won't attempt to resolve itself.
There is this minor pain when you're doing it, like this discourse over, is it a form of self-harm? Just because I wasn't like cutting my wrist or anything, was I like microdosing self-harm by like pulling out these hairs? I mean, people talk about self-harm as like initially pain, but like at least it's pain you have control over. And then after you do it, this feeling of like release or relief. It's like that's exactly what I feel when I do it. Yeah. So like, is it self harm? That's a whole other that's a whole other can of
Right?
worms.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
that's like a huge common thread among survivors. Like, I have a lot of personal experience on that side, and I think I've changed my tune on what is self-harm since I educated myself about the trauma. It does just sound like sometimes those neural pathways form like early, but then
Yeah.
you could even take like that internal family systems model and apply it there and be like, that part of me is still stuck in the past. And it thinks like this is the only way to get relief. And I feel like that can look all sorts of ways. Even athletes who overexercise could technically, that could be self-injurious behavior too.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think even like disordered eating, right?
Yeah.
Um,
It feels like there is no control, but there is. It's like I can control this one little thing. It's the only thing I can do, so I guess I'll do it.
yeah, that's such the funny thing, right? Like it's a compulsive thing that I do. So I don't really feel like I have control over it, but on some level I know that like my brain is doing it as a form of control or like expressing control. And so it's so funny trying to like think about like, okay, well, how do I quit this? I don't know that I can. I would like to. I would like to push it on to maybe some other kind of like healthier coping mechanism.
And just like having the self-compassion, like I feel like especially traumatized people have this desire to put a timeline on everything, myself included.
Yes.
And it's like, this doesn't fit neatly in a calendar. And if the best thing I did for myself today was wake up and take a shower, then great. What does the future hold for you? What do you see that looking like? You're welcome to share how you foresee this experience shaping it, for good or for worse.
Oh, that's a big question. I think it definitely strengthened my empathy. Even though I hadn't, been raped myself, I just always kind of felt like this really strong compassion for rape and CSA victims. And I mean, I'm an empathetic person generally, so I didn't really think that was surprising. And then when I learned about like the intersex community too, and all the ways that they've been medically abused and parents have been lied to and misinformed about what is being done to their children, I felt a lot of compassion too. And now it really makes sense why. Intersex community, they talk about medical trauma. Child rape victims experience a lot of the same symptoms we do. A lot of stuff lines up there. I think that's one strength, is just like the really strong compassion for people who have been through hard things, right? And a lot of compassion for children too. So even though we might not be able to have our own children, I don't know if I'm ever going to be in a place with my mental health where I feel comfortable going through pregnancy and childbirth in our current medical system, with the great chance that I will be like re-traumatized. I could do all this work on my trauma and vaginismus just to, get kicked on my ass again with a traumatic birth or pregnancy experience. I try to do well by my nieces and nephews. Future for me is kind of a question mark still. I think I'm still kind of like finding myself in a weird way and figuring out like the aftermath. So it's like now I know this puzzle piece of like it was this trauma, and it's kind of like, where do I go from here? Like I'm still trying to figure out how to make friends, right? Like I find myself even doing this with the support group of like, Well, I sent this thing and no one really responded to it. And so it must mean that everybody hates me and I said the wrong thing and I should just shut up and like not talk in the group anymore. I turn it around and I blame myself. I'm like, everyone hates me and I'm terrible. I need to stay out of this group. So like, I need to figure out how to make friends. I need to rebuild trust with myself and my body, learn my body, because I'm discovering like I spent the first 19 years of my life super prudish, but I love doing sexual things. I'm like, oh my gosh, like now that I'm like uncovering all this stuff, I'm like, wow, I actually have like a really high libido. I really love being intimate. It's just like right now it has to look a little bit different, but I'm hoping one day we can like fold in like PIV stuff between me and my husband, but like learning my body and learning to love my body. I don't know. There's like so much, right?
Everything
Like,
you just said, like, is already so much to do. Like, I have to learn
it's
my
so
body.
much to
It's
talk
so
about.
easy. Like all these things
Yeah.
you do in childhood that you have to do now, and you're just like looking around at these other adults, like, how are y'all functioning? Like, what, you already learned this stuff?
Yeah. There's productivity stuff too. Like, I mean, I know you've talked about having like ADHD. I'm kind of curious if I'm on like an autism spectrum or an ADHD spectrum because like of issues I'm finding like at my workplace and stuff too with like being productive. And so it's also trying to figure out that. Like, so I feel like in no area of my life am I fully satisfied. So
Yeah.
future Emilee hopefully has a better grasp on like making, building, and strengthening friendships, loving herself, loving her body, better intimacy, continuing with compassion towards others, and continuing to learn. Yeah.